like to just start out with kind of an overview of education and transition into discussing kind of some reoccurring trends that I've seen occurring within our judicial system with respect to their approach with equal education opportunity. As most of you are aware, for decades, stakeholders in education have worked tirelessly to ensure that every child, regardless of their race, class, gender, if they have a disability, has the opportunity to have a high-quality education. But despite these efforts, as we've seen with recent reports and articles within the New York Times, the achievement gap continues to widen, the opportunity gap continues to widen. And what we've seen is that racial disparities within the educational landscape are becoming a very prominent and disturbing fixture. The shortfalls of our education system are very disconcerting because democracy and education are inextricably linked. As a nation with a foundation built on democracy, how can we continue to uphold our democratic ideals of equality, freedom, and we always hear justice for all, when we continue to allow an education system to persist that privileges some while marginalizing others? This notion is best described in a quote by Kenneth Galbraith, which reads, "Education makes democracy possible. And along with economic development, it makes it necessary, even inevitable." Historically, as Professor McNeil mentioned, our legal system and stakeholders in education have really relied heavily on our court system to bring forth substantive change within the educational realm. Specifically, this is due to the fact that courts are in a very unique position to bring forth widespread systemic change through their judicial decisions. As a result, again, there's this tendency to really look to the court system as being for guidance and as well as a tool, or as she referred to as a social engineer for substantive change. However, what we've seen happening is that although law is often viewed as the great equalizer, the problem solver, it can also run counter to traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Specifically, efforts to achieve education equity have been significantly undermined by a series of Supreme Court decisions, which I will briefly mention. And what I've seen with these Supreme Court decisions is this trend of the notion of promoting equity or pursuing equity under the guise of neutrality. In recent years, equal education opportunity jurisprudence has shifted from a focus of race-conscious approaches to race-neutral approaches to achieving diverse and equitable schools. This paradigm shift is largely due to the colorblind rhetoric and jurisprudence that has inundated the discourse around issues of access and equity. The modern-day construction of colorblindness as a justification for limiting the use of race-conscious measures is evidenced in decisions such as Rodriguez's case, as well as the parents involved in Seattle school districts. The legal issue in Parents Involved v. Seattle School Districts addressed whether schools could voluntarily integrate racially segregated schools using a race-conscious school assignment plan. Ironically, over 50 years ago, the legal issue in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case was whether schools, or rather public schools, could be required to integrate in order to create, again, these diverse and equitable schools. So you can see the divergent legal issues in the Parents Involved case versus the Brown v. Board of Education case from being whether they could voluntarily integrate or be required to integrate, which really demonstrates how, from a cultural standpoint, too, this shift towards this colorblind rhetoric has become very prominent. So the Parents Involved case really, to me, demonstrates the court's continued slow retreat from pursuing and also achieving the work that Charles Hamilton Houston started so many years ago towards equal opportunity within the United States. So this demise of race-conscious approaches to ensuring equal education opportunity is also evident if you look at the recent Fisher v. University of Texas case, As some of you might be familiar with, the plaintiff in that particular case, Abigail Fisher, sued the University of Texas at Austin to challenge the university's use of race in their school admissions process. The plaintiff argued that the University of Texas admission policy exceeded the parameters established in the Grutter v. Bollinger case because the University of Texas achieved a racially diverse student body through their top 10% program. And essentially what this top 10% program entailed is they automatically accepted any student that graduated in the top 10% of their high school into the University of Texas. So you can imagine with schools being racially segregated due to segregated housing patterns, this provided the University of Texas a unique way or opportunity to create a diverse pool of applicants by taking, again, the top 10%. What I find alarming about this top 10% program, I often hear from my colleagues who rave about this program. This is great. They say this is a wonderful race-neutral way of creating this diverse student population, but I guess my criticism with the top 10% program is I look at it as a Band-Aid. Essentially, it's still not taking care of the underlying fundamental issues that are undermining, individuals' abilities and opportunities to have a high-quality education. In a sense, it's saying it's okay if we leave the schools racially segregated and inherently unequal, as long as the top 10% from each of those unequal, inherently segregated schools have an opportunity. And so I'm very disturbed with this trend of not really taking substantive steps to bring forth systemic change that doesn't just impact the top 10% of school students, but the other 90% as well. And so the question remains, if you look at, again, this kind of trend of the court pushing this colorblind rhetoric as a means of achieving education equity, the question that looms for me, as well as what Professor Lamont mentioned in his talk, is where do we go from here? How do we fulfill the great work that Charles Hamilton Houston started so long ago? And I too love Charles Hamilton Houston's notion about social engineering, so I'd like to read his direct quote with respect to being a social engineer. He says that a Negro lawyer must be trained as a social engineer and a group interpreter. Due to the Negro's social and political condition, the Negro lawyer must be prepared to anticipate, guide, and interpret his group advancement. Moreover, he must act as a business advisor for the protection of the scattered resources possessed and controlled by the group. He must provide more ways and means for holding within the group the income that is flowing through it. This is a really powerful call to action by Charles Hamilton Houston that I think still rings true today. It is very essential that we all serve as social engineers to dismantle the structural and institutional inequality. As social engineers, I think that we can create better opportunities for people and, again, carry on the work that Charles Hamilton Houston created or started so long ago. And so when I think about social engineering, what does it mean to be a social engineer? And what my perception of a social engineer is having a spirit of activism. One thing that I find disconcerting is I don't feel like there's the spirit of activism that's necessary to bring forth the type of community, grassroots effort that it would take to really bring forth, again, systemic change. And so when I thought about and considering, how could we use this social engineering to fulfill the legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston, I thought about three key areas that we could focus on: education, unemployment, and greater proximity to our communities. With respect to education, as I mentioned earlier, the correlation between education and democracy, I think students that are not graduating from high school, that are not able to matriculate into college, they're being denied the opportunity not only to fully participate in a democratic society, but they're also being sent along a path that's going to make them at a greater risk, for poverty, health issues, and other types of structural barriers that are in place for individuals that are not educated in a way that can allow them to be self-fulfilling. In terms of education, I'm thinking of course, the achievement gap, the opportunity gap, and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. Second, unemployment, because I know that my time is running short. I find the unemployment numbers extremely disconcerting for several reasons. First of all, the fact that the higher unemployment rates are in our urban cities that have high people of color concentrations. Although the national unemployment rate is 7.4%, cities such as Chicago and Detroit have higher percentages of individuals that are unemployed. In this country, where white unemployment has never reached 10% since the Great Depression, but black unemployment has rarely dipped below 10% since the records have been kept. Therefore, our problems are really a structural problem. In fact, if white unemployment remained at the level that blacks has for the past 40 years, I'm very confident that we would launch a New Deal program to get people back to work. We'd invest in job training and education and encourage some home ownership, just as they did with the GI Bill after World War II, but that's not happening. Additionally, we tend to get distracted by things such as, I keep hearing in the media about sagging pants. If one more person mentions sagging pants are not the sole reason that African American males are not getting jobs. It's racial, social, and class inequality that is contributing to the heart of the unemployment rate with African American males. It's the disproportionate incarceration of young black men and the more than 700,000 stop and frisk that have occurred on New York City streets. Those are the types of structural and social and racial inequalities that we have to address, not whether or not these little boys' pants are sagging. Lastly, greater proximity to our communities. Often when I'm traveling, I hear people outraged about education and unemployment, voter right violations, and yet I often ask them, what have they personally done within their own communities? What is their proximity to children and families that are in need? A lot of times the individuals that are in a position of power to really provide or serve as a social engineer within their communities often forget to turn around and look back once they've gotten to the position where they can be a social engineer. So I really think it's important that we reconnect with our communities and collectively pool our resources together to bring forth meaningful substantive change. This notion is best described in this last quote with respect to greater proximity to our communities by Charles Hamilton Houston. He said, "This fight for equality was not an isolated struggle. All our struggles must tie in together and support one another. We must remain on the alert and push the struggle farther away with all our might." Thank you.